Howdy, kids. It's Amber here with a very special hearty helping of political education vegetables. Today we're going to learn about the European Union. But why, you may ask? Well, American leftists are very much in the dark about the EU, and my interest in European politics is somewhat self-serving as an American socialist. Yes, I believe in building solidarity between American leftists and the European workers whose democracies are being undermined by an extranational machine of capital. But more directly, EU politics generally, and Brexit more specifically, are essential case studies that American leftists should learn from. Our nation, little American left, has not been pulled from traditional working class institutions. And with the U.S. labor movement on its back for years now, our little ranks have a massive generational gap starting around the end of history. So you may have noticed, if you're in DSA, that every American leftist is either under 30 or over 80. And if they are under 30, they're usually downwardly mobile, middle-class college graduates. Working-class Bernie-crats aside, the majority of self-described American leftists have only very recently migrated over from the progressive wing of neoliberalism. And as such, the positions on things like trade or domestic manufacturing and energy, tariffs, borders, movement, and who controls the supply of labor still reflect liberal hegemony. I have trouble, for example, explaining the anti-globalization protests of the 90s to recent recruits of Democratic Socialists of America. I'm a little too young to actually remember them, but they didn't happen that long ago, and they do represent a last stand against free trade. When the anti-globalization movement is remembered at all, it's interpreted as xenophobic, backward, or in some way reactionary. Seemingly counterintuitively, the discussions of fair and humane immigration policy are largely outnumbered by kind of anarchist and libertarian platitudes who often end up espousing policies that result in hyper-exploitation at home and abroad. So all of this is just to say that I'm not a Europhile or a specialist in European politics. I'm just very committed to building socialism in America, and I see EU and the Brexit debates as a good seg to get our listenership to be a little more skeptical about, let's call it liberal internationalism, and think more critically about the role of global capital in shaping that ideology. So with that, I am joined by Costas Lapavitsas, professor of economics at SOAS University in London, briefly a Syriza MP, and author of The Left Case Against the EU, out from Polity Books. Costas, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be discussing these very important issues with you.
Thanks. So, just starting from the beginning, because this is an American audience largely, what is the European Union and who runs it?
The European Union has been in existence for well over 50 years now, so 60 years now. So it's something that has changed over the course of time. It began as basically a trade and industry support framework, and then gradually it has begun to look like a transnational organization that has the attributes of a state. So it has changed a lot in the course of its history. I would say that right now it's a neoliberal citadel. It is a vast array of institutions that protect the interests of big business and big banks. It is thoroughly undemocratic and anti-democratic, and it is run by a cabal of unelected people or people elected in their own countries, very powerful people who make huge decisions of profound importance behind the backs of workers, the poor, the broad layers of the population in Europe, who know that something is not right and oppose it, basically.
Right. So how did it come to be? Like, who were the architects of the EU? I know it's very old.
Sure. The EU was set up in the late 50s, the time of the Cold War. The United States was behind it. They understood it as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. And it was basically French capitalists, German capitalists allying themselves to each other to protect the coal industry and to protect agriculture, coal and steel industry and to protect agriculture. That's how it began. In those days, these were the days of the long post-war boom, the days of Keynesianism. The European Union was understood as an interstate alliance that could intervene in markets, that could affect the economy in important ways, that we could have a social democratic dimension, like the world was social democratic then. Even in the United States, you had mechanisms of intervention and of controlling markets. But since the early 1990s, late 1980s, all that has died, basically finished, and this is now a thoroughly neoliberal outfit. Since the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, it's a thoroughly neoliberal outfit, the European Union, which basically protects free markets, promotes free markets, and protects big business and big banks within it. Decisions are made by the European Council. The European Parliament is not a real parliament. The European Central Bank is an enormously powerful institution, and the European Commission is a set of bureaucrats and administrators who, again, are not democratically accountable to anyone. It's a bizarre outfit. It's the strangest collection of institutions that has a huge democratic deficit right at its core at the present moment.
Right. So it's developed and changed over time through sort of expansion and growth. How has it grown, and what is this Europeanism, this economic project of Europeanism, as it means now in our present moment?
Yes, that's a very good question, and that's exactly what we've got to explain as far as the left is concerned. You see, in the 1980s, the decade in which neoliberalism emerged, things began to change politically and socially across the world, of course, and they changed in Europe. That's when the big change occurred in Europe, in the European Union, and then it took official form in the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992. What happened in the 1980s is that basically two things. The workers' movement was defeated in key parts of the continent, and organized labor became less and less confident in itself and capable of taking on capital. That's the first thing that happened. And the second thing that happened in the 1980s was, of course, late 1980s, was, of course, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc removed any notion that there was an alternative way of doing things. I've never supported what was there, I should make that clear. But nonetheless, a lot of people thought that this was another way of doing things, and the left could learn something from it. So the combination of worker weakness and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc delivered a huge blow to the European left. The European left lost confidence in itself. It stopped believing they could change the world, that it could tackle capitalism, they could make things work in a different way. In that context, Europe, an imaginary Europe, and the European Union started to look like the promised land. That was the alternative, you see, for a lot of people. If you can't change the world where you are, if you can't take capital on where you are, if you can't make things better, shift the balance in favor of workers and the poor where you are, and begin to put in place mechanisms of solidarity that are based on working people and so on across Europe, then maybe the European Union is your answer. Maybe that's where you will find paradise. And a lot of the left in Europe has come to believe in it. The European Union has emerged for much of the left in Europe as the promised land. It's an incredible development and an incredible historical farrago, because, of course, traditionally, the European left was very critical of the European Union, very critical for the right reasons. But its historical defeat of the left has seen it transform the European Union in its own head into a very nice project, a very good project, a left-wing project. It's unconscionable, but that's what's happened in Europe.
Right, despite the fact that it's completely anti-democratic and outside any kind of democratic control within the nation state.
If anyone goes near the beast and sees how it works, there can be no doubt as to what it is. Brussels is one of the largest centers in the world for business lobbying. After Washington, it's number 2. And that's not accidental, right? Because big business knows which way its bread is buttered. The operations of the mechanisms in Brussels and so on, the administration and the various bureaucratic mechanisms in Brussels are completely opaque and undemocratic and anti-democratic. If you go anywhere near it, you know that this is not a left-wing project, and it can never become a left-wing project. Only if you're far away from it, you imagine it to be something that it never is, it never was, and never can be. That's how it works, basically.
Right. So we talked a little bit about the escalation in EU influence and power in the 80s. So I think a lot of people are a little confused about what the single market is and what a single currency means. So could you explain what those concepts mean to capital, to European nation states, and to European workers, respectively? I know that's a lot of questions, but...
Sure. The shift in Europe in ideology and in policies, as I mentioned, was neoliberal, clearly. Now, neoliberalism in Europe has evolved around two pillars. One is the single market, the other is the single currency. For most of the European Union, not all of it, but for most of it, they go together. The single market is basically a kind of institutional framework that homogenizes the way markets work and the way trade is undertaken across Europe. It's actually what big business wants. It's designed to serve the purposes of big business, engaging in capitalist activity across borders with minimum interruption and minimum costs and so on. The single market is designed to serve all the needs of large European industrial and commercial conglomerates, big business. Single currency was a very ambitious and, in my judgment, ultimately foolish bid to establish another leg to that, to complement it, right? Have a single currency that would actually unify and homogenize the monetary sphere. So not only can you do business in markets that are homogenized across Europe, but you also use the same money. You go to one central bank to make life easier. You go to one common market in loanable capital for banks. So you unify the situation from the side of production and from the side of finance. And you create an integrated neoliberal realm. That's the basic idea. The most powerful institution in that is, of course, the European Central Bank. To do that, you need a bank that will coordinate this activity and this effort, and that's the European Central Bank. It's the most undemocratic institution in Europe. It's a bizarre central bank. It sort of sits above Europe with enormous firepower and enormous social and economic power. No one controls it. It's not accountable to anyone. And it sets the terms of reference for both the single currency and, to a certain extent, the single market. In addition to that, what Europe has created is the European Court of Justice, which is another bizarre and undemocratic institution. It's like a high court or a Supreme Court that is not accountable to anyone, and which creates law and interprets law that then applies across borders. And it is law over which the population of Europe, the workers and others of Europe, have got very little say. It is the definition of being undemocratic. So the combination of the European Central Bank and the European Court of Justice is enough to show you what I mean by absence of democracy and an integral lack of democracy in this single market, single currency space. That is neoliberalism in its essence in Europe. That's basically what we have.
Right. So we know that let's say the homogenization of currency and markets benefits capital, because then things can grease the wheels, things can move more quickly. What does that mean to member states? Let's say, what does it mean to Germany versus what does it mean to, let's say, Greece?
Right. Now we come to difficult things because, of course, we're going to talk about the states and then we'll have to talk about workers, what it does to workers. And the two things are connected. One thing that people must realize when they talk about the European Union is much of this stuff about the transnational aspect of the Union, in other words, this entity that goes across borders and so on and makes all these powerful decisions. One key thing about it is that it hasn't actually abolished the nation states. It's incorrect to think that the European Union diminishes the nation state or eliminates the nation state or makes it irrelevant, which is what a lot of European socialists often imagine. Far from it. The nation state is very much there. Europe is still very much a collection of states, and the European Union is an alliance of states. Actually, you have very powerful ruling classes represented by their states in the European Union, which defend their sectional interests and their particular interests. And what happens is they use the mechanisms of the European Union, the transnational mechanisms of the European Union, to do things which they would have been unable to do otherwise, to promote interests, particular interests, in ways that they would have been unable to do otherwise. In this context, what has emerged in Europe is once again a tremendous hierarchy of nation. What has happened is far from the convergence of the partners on the basis of solidarity and all these other very nice things that people imagine about the European Union. What has emerged is actually divergence, precisely because the nation states are there, they're defending their interests, and they're promoting their interests. We've got a core in the European Union, a very powerful core. Germany sits at the top of it. German big business in particular sits at the top of it. France is part of the core, but France cannot compete with Germany. France has become decisively weaker part of the core. And then there are a number of peripheries in Europe. Peripheries have emerged left, right, and center in Europe as a result of the Union, let me stress, as a result of the European Union. There is the Southern European periphery. There is the Central European periphery. There is the Baltic periphery. There is an Eastern European periphery, some of which is in Europe, in the European Union, some of which is outside. There is a remarkable peripheralization of Europe. There is no convergence. And different states in those peripheries have got different power, and there is a different ranking among them. That's the reality of Europe. In other words, what we've got is the recreation of imperialism in a different guise.
Financial imperialism.
Financial and productive. Industrial imperialism. Greece is in a very different position to Germany in this. They are not partners, right? They're not, and they never will be. At the core of this system lies German industrial capital, not financial capital, but industrial capital. At the core of it lies German industrial capital. That is really the dominant economic power in the system. There is a vast industrial complex in Germany, cars, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, machine tools, the core of German industrial organization. Big business runs that, huge corporations that run that. And to them, the arrangements as they exist in Europe right now are very, very favorable. They've emerged as the dominant force in Europe, economic force in Europe. And around them, they have built a network of relations that dictate the shape of economic life in Europe. Much of Central Europe, for instance, and much of Eastern Europe is directly connected to this industrial base in Germany. Countries in the south of Europe, now the southern periphery, are weakly related to this. For them, it's financial capital that sets the terms of reference. So it's a complex array of relations building on the predominance of Germany, building on industrial capital at the heart of the European Union, German capital in particular. One last thing about this, just to get the picture clear, the main aim of this big business, this German industrial capital, is exports. It's an export machine. Those German big businesses do not want to create a large domestic market for themselves. That's not really their policy. Their policy is exports. And in that context, They have come to dominate the European market, which was initially an export market for them, but has gradually become a domestic market. They've incorporated it. And then the world. On this basis, the world. So Germany is the biggest exporter in the world proportionately.
Right. I think this is what Wolfgang Streeck meant when he referred to the EU as German European hegemony posing as the European ideal.
That's exactly it. It is exactly it. It is actually conditional hegemony. That's how I call it in my book. It's conditional hegemony, and the point is important. After the Second World War, the United States emerged as a hegemonic power across the world because of its economic and military preponderance. We all know in 1945, the United States was a giant, right? Economically, militarily, financially. That hegemonic power at that time proceeded to create an array of institutions through which it projected imperial power. United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, a whole array of institutions. The United States and its ruling elite, its ruling class, consciously set out to create these institutions through which they projected their power and through which American imperialism became the dominant force in the world. That's not what's happening in Europe. That's not how German hegemony works. It's very important to understand that. German capital doesn't have similar power. It's not big enough. And that's not how it dominates Europe. It is conditional hegemony, conditional on the existence of the European Union and its institutions, which were not created by Germany. You understand? Germany inherited or found these institutions there. They were jointly created. French capital also played a role in that. What Germany has done, though, is to play the game very carefully and to benefit from the institutions and to bend the institutions to the interests of its big business and big capital. Has been very successful. German big capital has been very successful in that. In that way, German hegemony is conditional. Historically, I suppose, it could not have been otherwise. It's hard to think of another way in which German capital, after the destruction of the Second World War, after the chaos that German armies had caused across the world, would have emerged as a hegemonic power in Europe. It's hard to think of any other way. In a way, it's an indirect method. Right. Through which it's happened.
So one of the biggest arguments I've heard against the EU from British socialist and left trade unionists is that it essentially makes socialism illegal. Like they use that phrase. So what restrictions does the European Union put on member countries?
Let me start by saying one important thing about the German working class first, just to dispel any misunderstandings. And then I will tell you what I think are the structural impediments for workers. We can talk about Germany as the hegemonic power, and I did, conditional hegemony. But one thing that we've got to be clear is that this hegemony has emerged on the back of German workers. German workers are not the beneficiaries of this in any serious way, this ascendancy of German capital. Because, of course, the reason why Germany has succeeded economically within the European Union is by suppressing workers' wages, is through a series of neoliberal reforms of the labor market that basically devastated the conditions of life of German workers, their ability to organize, their ability to find secure jobs. The German labor market has been split into a section with fairly stable jobs and a much larger section with insecure, precarious, and so on employment. And it is this destruction of the conditions of labor in Germany that have allowed German big business has allowed German big business to emerge dominant. Now, that's not accidental. You see, Germany has been more successful at doing what the rest of the European Union has also done, right? Or at least the rest of the European Union wishes to do. Other countries have adopted similar policies. Other countries have been systematically attacking the labor force, deregulating, liberalizing, trying to drive wages down, and so on. It is embedded in the European Union and in its labor policies. And I say that because a lot of people got wrong impressions about it. They think that the European Union protects labor. It doesn't. It shifts the pressure onto labor of economic adjustment. Now, what does this mean, or what would it mean for a radical government? Let's suppose you have a radical government that gets elected that believes in alternative policies, that wants to undo austerity, and he wants to start implementing
say nationalization projects.
Major changes, nationalization, boost demand, support people's incomes, create good jobs, definancialize the economies of Europe, start doing basic things that people want, right? Start providing better public utilities, have public property over key resources, public property over banks, the basic things that all of us have agreed are necessary if the world is to find some economic rationality.
Right.
What would happen? Well, a government like that could expect, first of all, the absolute utter hostility of the existing structures of the European Union. This is no speculation. We know that this is what's going to happen. We know from historical experience, from the Syriza government elected in 2015, which did propose some radical measures, and it was met with unrelenting hostility. And the hostility never subsided until Syriza had surrendered. The reason is, of course, neoliberalism is an embedded ideology in the European Union. But of course, it's not just ideology. It's also institutional practice now. A government of the left can expect institutional hostility. Much of it will pivot on industrial policy and what is and what is not allowed. Much of it will pivot on regulations about finance and how finance is monitored and what banks are supposed to do. And all that will be implemented through the Commission, the European Commission and its various bodies that have got huge power over economies, and of course the European Court of Justice, which is the final arbiter. So if there are any disputes, for example, about state aid, which you can expect to come across. So you have a left-wing government, wishes to pursue an industrial policy that supports key industries that the government, in conjunction with workers, is determined. You can expect legal cases will be brought against the government in the European Court of Justice, and you can expect that the European Court of Justice will find against such a government because European law does not allow for decisive intervention. That's just one example. One final point of this, there's a big difference between being in the monetary union and being outside the monetary union as far as the left government is concerned. If a left government was elected in a country that is in the monetary union, it can also expect hostility from the European Central Bank, absolute hostility from the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank has got means of squeezing the life out of a left-wing government by, of course, controlling liquidity, controlling the provision of liquidity to the banking system of a country and making sure that the country is left gasping for inability to create money, inability to provide the basic liquidity needs of the economy on a daily basis. That's what happened with the Syriza government in 2015. So radicalism and the European Union do not go together. Socialism and the European Union do not go together. Anyone who attempts to implement radical socialist policies in the European Union will quickly realize the forces that what the forces are that are arrayed against them.
So one of the more interesting arguments I've heard for, say, among the British who want to remain is they refer to the migrant crisis. I remember one woman in particular bringing up Syrian refugees, and I know I'm American and we're all very bad at geography, but I wasn't aware that Syria was in Europe. So it was kind of a strange red herring to see thrown in there. How does the EU relate to the migrant crisis, and why is it being invoked?
I think the migrant issue is one of the most bizarre issues here in the context of defending the European Union. In some ways, it's the biggest inversion of reality. There are two things I want to say on that. If you look at the broader picture, a European Union in the world, which is how you should do in order to assess the question of the Syrian refugees and people who are coming from Africa and so on. In other words, people who are trying to come into the European Union from the outside, which basically means Africa and the Middle East. If you do that, if you take the broader picture into consideration, the European Union looks like one of the most hostile, racist, and despicable in a way bodies in the world, basically. The way it treats people coming in from the outside. In some ways, it's worse than the United States. I know that a lot of people will not believe that because of what Trump has been doing, the border with Mexico. But believe me, the European Union is not any better. It's actually worse. Effectively, right now, as far as the outside world is concerned, the European Union has established a series of concentration camps. Some of them are within its own borders, say in Greece or in Italy. And some of them, far bigger, are outside its borders, in Turkey, in the Lebanon, and so on. These concentration camps are consciously supported by the European Union and financed by the European Union in order to keep people trapped there to stop them from coming into Europe. That is really the policy of the European Union, and consciously so. To look at that and to consider the European Union as a defender of free movement is not just absurd, it's an affront. It's an affront to anything and everything that socialists should believe or could believe about the rights of workers and the rights of human beings more generally. And just to drive the point home, when the Syrian crisis was at its worst in 2015-16, the numbers that tried to break into Europe, tried to break through this iron border and get into Europe, were not that big, to be honest. We're talking about 1 million, 2 million people. I mean, that's in a vast continent with hundreds of millions of people, inhabitants there already. We're not talking big numbers. The big European powers, Germany accepted, and that should be said because it's very important. The big European powers, France, Britain, Spain, and so on, disgraced themselves, completely disgraced themselves. They used the concentration camps that I mentioned and refused to take refugees, and refused even to deliver the basic humanitarian obligations that all human beings should have towards others who find themselves in a terrible predicament because of war and everything else. So that's the reality of the European Union towards others outside its borders. Now, if you look at what happens inside its borders, which is what people typically do, there you get many people on the left rhapsodizing about freedom of movement. And they think that, that's it. That's socialism somehow. So basically, you have a ring of concentration camps around Fortress Europe, but within Europe, you've got socialist policy of freedom of movement, as if this could ever happen. Mm-hmm. When you look more closely, however, at this so-called freedom of movement, you realize what it is. It is actually the freedom of capital to shift workers about. That's basically what it is. It is the freedom of capital to allow Czech workers or whatever they are, Polish workers. It's not so much Czech workers because in the Czech Republic there's full employment, but Polish workers to come to Britain, say, and work with Polish wages and Polish conditions, posted workers. That's what they're. In other words, freedom of movement, okay, but not freedom to have the same rights as the people in the country in which you moved. So it is the right of people to move and live in very poor conditions with very low wages in Lincolnshire and in Norfolk, agricultural parts of Britain, collecting the produce for a fraction of the wages that British workers would have asked for. That's the kind of freedom that we're talking about. That's what the freedom of movement means, down to the ground, right? Socialists should not be in favor of this kind of freedom of movement. We're
Right.
not in we're not in favor of the freedom of capital to move workers about. Yes, we're in favor of workers moving across borders, seeking a better life. Of course, they've got the right to do that, and we should be open to workers who've got a commonality of interest and a commonality of purposes and a basic solidarity and union of outlook. But the people who come in must have the same rights, must have access to housing, must have access to health. They must allow the incumbent workers to continue to exist the way they did before. There must be provision, conditions, and terms under which this happens. Yeah, that's the kind of freedom of movement we want, and that's the kind of policies we want to put in place in a socialist regime, in a socialist economy, I would say.
Yeah, it's actually like a very disturbingly impressive innovation to be able to exploit workers from poorer countries within the borders of your own country in that way. It's really shocking, and I think most people don't know that people are working under the standards of their home country, despite they have the freedom to be essentially displaced and shuffled around at the whims of capital.
That's it. And that is presented as somehow a major advance for humanity. Now, having said this, of course, there are many types of labor in any economy, as you know. There are many professional jobs. There are many opportunities for people to move and get better jobs across borders. There is that too. That's a very important part. And there are many types of professions and so on, which that's how people work and live. And so it's a very different condition for them. However, for large numbers of manual workers, especially for the poorest and the weakest, that's not the reality at all, right? That's not the reality at all of freedom of movement.
Yeah, you have Polish workers picking strawberries for Polish wages in Britain.
And in Romanians and you name it, even worse, Bulgarians, being exploited left, right, and center, living in terrible conditions, picking strawberries, as you say, and other agricultural produce, or doing very menial jobs in the big cities, living in hovels and in small little rooms and being paid a pittance. That socialists are not in favor of that. They should never be in favor of that. Right. That's not socialism, right? That's not an advance for humanity.
Right. So, I mean, this is the reality. The EU is not some, bastion of left internationalism or international humanitarianism. It's, bourgeois cosmopolitanism at best. How have they managed to convince such a large number of people? Do people just really like their holidays in Majorca that much? How has it developed its reputation?
The most striking case of that is Britain. I've lived in this country for a long time, very long time. And I remember well when I first came here many decades ago, the British left, which was never the most radical of the lefts in Europe, of course, right? It was always fairly modest in its outlook and in its demands and so on. But at that time, and I'm talking about the 70s and 80s, the British left, the Labour left, had within it a very strong body of Eurosceptic opinion, which was basically right. Tony Benn, Michael Foot, Barbara Castle, a number of socialist figures from those days who actually explained chapter and verse what the European Union was and what it was likely to do, and they were right. They guessed right. That's gone. Or that's very, very weak now. That tradition is very weak. Why? That's the question you're asking me in some ways at that level. Why? And I think it is the weakness of the left that I mentioned to you when we started this discussion. The inability to believe in yourself, that you can actually take on the beast where you live, that you can change the terms of life and the conditions of existence and the way the economy works and who makes decisions and so on, where you live. The left has stopped believing in that. And fundamentally, much of the left in Europe has stopped believing that it can challenge capitalism. That's basically what's at the heart of it. The left in the last 2-3 decades has come to believe that the best we can hope for is to manage capitalism. Tweak it a bit, improve it a bit, make sure that its worst, the most unhuman in human aspects are sort of ameliorated. Well, if you believe that, yes, then you'd accept the European Union, because you're not going to challenge the institutions of capitalism. You're not going to challenge the main structures of capitalism in Europe. You think that this is madness, that it is radicalism gone crazy, and so on. So that has happened to large parts of the left. Lack of belief in themselves and lack of belief in running society differently, challenging capitalism, overthrowing capitalism, moving in a socialist direction. In some ways, the US left is healthier than the European left in this regard.
Well, let's not go crazy.
Well, there's more of a belief in itself and a belief in socialism and the desirability of socialism and delivering socialism. The European left has lost much of that traditional historical confidence it had in itself. Mm. And the Europhilism is the result of that.
Right.
If you're weak, if you don't believe in yourself, then Europe is your savior. You go there and hope for the best, and let's improve this bit a little and do something somewhere else, and that's the best we can do. Much of the European left thinks that way,
Mm-hmm. Sort of on that subject, you're in the UK and have been for a while. When the Brexit referendum results came in, I was, I think like most people, very shocked, and I was alarmed. I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be a ruthless Tory Brexit and UKIP is going to surge, and then none of that happened. UKIP collapsed, and the Tories are in a tailspin, and Labour is ascendant. So despite all the media spectacle, what do you make of this sort of alarmism and these, so-called Remoaner calls for a second referendum, arguing that it's reformable?
I think I've said enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
to make it clear that in my own view is that this is not something that can be reformed, right? Mm-hmm. People who think that you can reform this beast either don't know it or they're being disingenuous. Mm-hmm. They're not being honest.
Right.
The European Union has to be challenged head on. The institutions that make it run have to be tackled, broken. New things have to emerge in Europe. If that means exiting, then so be it, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Let me come to Brexit now. Brexit is of crucial importance. There have been two major events, political events in Europe the last 10 years, since the great crisis of 2007, 2009. Two great political events which matter very much for the left. The first was Syriza in Greece, and essentially the betrayal of the hopes of the left, and the demonstration in practice that you cannot reform the European Union. You're going to have a completely hostile force against you. The second is Brexit. Now, Brexit was not created by the left. No. The left, in a sense, inherited Brexit. Brexit was created by a division within the British ruling class and its political representatives. I stress the political representatives because the division within the British ruling class is actually more a political division, not an economic division. And it's not an economic division manifestly, so it's easy to show it. Big British business, big British industry, commercial capital, and of course, the City of London, which is hugely important in this country, are against Brexit. They hate Brexit. They don't want it. So they won't remain. It's clear. The centers of power, economic power, and social power in this country are against Brexit. Clearly. They openly say it. It's not. You don't have to surmise it. All you've got to do is read the main newspapers. However, there's a political split in the British ruling class, and the political split is very important to understand what's happened in this country. The political split has to do with sovereignty and the way that Britain has positioned itself in the European Union politically as a political power. Britain has taken a defensive position in the European Union during the 4 decades of its membership, for a bit. Its basic position was, you make the treaties, we sign them, but we demand opt-outs. We demand exceptions. We keep our political interests separate, and to some extent our economic interests separate. And that's how Britain has sustained itself in the European Union for decades. What's happened in the last decade, since the Great Crisis, is that this has become untenable. It's just not possible to operate like that because of the single market and the single currency. And because the single market and the single currency that I discussed previously mean that the European Union has become less and less democratic and more run by emergency regulations and emergency decisions. There have been no treaties in Europe for 10 years. And there's nothing from which Britain can demand an exception from. Increasingly, the European Union is run by experts, cabals of administrators. It's that kind of reality. Britain has found it very difficult to maintain itself politically in that. Sovereignty began to move away, to drain away, and that caused political divisions within the British ruling class. That political division allowed the social split in Britain between the poor and the small minority at the top to come to the fore. And that's the social importance of Britain, or Brexit, you see. That division of the ruling class, political division, has allowed the poor, the working class, the disenchanted, the disenfranchised, all the marginal layers, which are huge in this country, to come to the fore. They found an opening, they found a break, they found a way through which they could come center stage, and they did. They were asked to give their opinion on membership of the European Union. They saw that the privileged elite, almost to the last person, said, we stay in. And the workers and the others said, well, if you say stay in, then there's something wrong with that, and let's get out. And that hasn't changed, That is still there. That is immovable. That the British workers, the poor and so on, have not changed their mind at all in this. Now, who gave leadership to it, to this attitude of British workers? Unfortunately, it wasn't the left. It wasn't the left because the left was lost in Europhile fantasies. That was the tragedy of it. If the left was there and if it provided radical answers to what the British people wanted in terms of command over their country, making decisions about economic policy, having a policy with regard to the labor market and so on. If the left was there, a lot of things would have been different, but the left was not there. So the right was there. The right was there, and it gave a thoroughly problematic racist tinge to it. Started talking about immigrants, started talking about foreigners, started talking about the imaginary past of Britain and so on. And it created that very, very unpleasant dimension. But then you have to ask yourself, was Brexit a racist thing at bottom? No, it wasn't. It's a mistake to think that Brexit was that. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Like you said, if you look at what happened the last 2 years, we haven't had an explosion of racism in this country. We haven't had a shift to the extreme right. None of this has happened. It's not true. I mean, obviously the right has been doing its level best. Of course, the extreme right has been doing its level best, and as it always will in these situations. But Brexit has not so far worked to strengthen the fascist right. It has not caused the racist outburst across the nation and so on. That's not what's happened. What has happened instead is that the poor of the country, the workers and so on, are refusing to move away from center stage. That's what's happening. All that talk about the British people have changed their mind. They now wish to go back and have a second referendum, and they wish to return to Europe and so on. It's just talk by mad Europhilists, or Europhiles. None of this is true. The country has moved to the left. He has supported the Labour Party openly in the last general election, a year after the referendum. It is desperate to have a serious left-wing program put in front of it, and Brexit would give it the opportunity to do so.
Right.
It's up to the left to grasp the opportunity.
Right. So just moving forward to sort of the political conditions of Brexit at the moment. there's a lot of talk of deal or no deal. There's recently an article in Jacobin by Alex Gurevich that said just called "Leave the EU already," where the subhead was just the European Union is one of the chief enemies of democracy in the world today. Britain should leave it with or without a Brexit deal. What is a no deal Brexit, and what does that mean?
Now we are moving into deep waters. It's true.
I know, and this might not make it, but I just want to make sure I have it.
Yeah. No, I will put it as plainly and as clearly as I possibly can. The European Union is an alliance, right? It's an alliance of sovereign states. They have not gone away, as I've already indicated. So treaties and sort of formal treaties dictate how nations and countries relate to each other, and that's what the issue is right now. How would Britain manage its relations with the European Union after it leaves? Now, no deal, technically speaking, doesn't exist. No matter what happens, there will be some form of deal, some kind of arrangement, some kind of treaty, right? Mm-hmm. So no deal, properly speaking, is a bogeyman. It's something created by the Remain side to scare the population, to scare workers and others, and benefit from that in terms of remaining or challenging Brexit and so on. That's the first thing that has to be said. We have to be very suspicious of anyone who bangs the drum about the danger, so-called, of no deal. The key thing here is this. Trade has become a very important issue in the treaty that Britain will have with the European Union. Trade has become a very important issue. In my judgment, it has become more important than it should be. And that's because the people who run the negotiations and so on the part of Britain are to a certain extent neoliberals themselves. So they've made trade into more important than it is. Nonetheless, here it is. They've made trade a key thing. So the question is, what kind of trade arrangement between Britain and the European Union? No deal essentially means that Britain would leave and it would revert to the conditions of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, as far as trading with the European Union is concerned. That means imposing tariffs, accepting tariffs on its own exports, and so on. Clearly, that would have implications for its trade, and that would have implications for exports from Britain and imports to Britain. It would hit British exporters significantly. It would also hit German and Dutch exporters very significantly, and it would hit Irish capitalists significantly, because the Irish trade with Britain extensively. So no deal basically means imposition of tariffs and the disturbance of trade as a result of that. Now, what's the position of socialists, or what should be the position of socialists? Obviously, socialists seems to me should say we want a deal. We want an amicable arrangement with the European Union. We want to continue trading. We're not in favor of autarky. Socialism is not about isolating Britain from the rest of the world. We're not talking about that. No one has ever spoken about this. We definitely want a deal. Yes, fine. But we want a deal that is balanced and that allows us to pursue policies the way we want to follow them to transform Britain. And we will not be blackmailed when it comes to that. And if you're going to use no deal as a blackmailing instrument, we're not going to accept it. We're not going to fall for it, because we can manage a no deal situation too if you're going to blackmail us with it. Mm-hmm. And make no mistake, the European Union has been blackmailing Britain. It's been a policy of blackmailing the country. And to this policy, the section of the British ruling class that is against Brexit has been complicit. Essentially, it's been an alliance of the European Union with significant sections of British capital, industrial and financial capital, to subvert Brexit, to make no deal into a huge threat, presumably, and to subvert Brexit indirectly. That's what's been happening. Socialists should not be frightened of no deal. If it comes to it, Britain should not accept blackmail. The working class of this country did not vote for Brexit on the basis of free trade. That's not really what it's about. It voted for Brexit because it wants to be able to make policies independently and in a sovereign way. If the European Union insists on it, if it wants to blackmail the country, then yes, so be it. No deal, so be it. That's not what we want. That's not what we're after, but we're not going to be blackmailed by it.
Okay. I actually think that that's a good place for us to stop. Thank you so much.
You take care, Amber.
You too.
Right.
Bye.
Care, Amber.
You too.
Right.
Bye.
Care, Amber.
You too.
Right.
Bye.
Care, Amber.
You too.